The Sony A6400 versus the Sony A6700. What do you actually get for $600 more? Is the Sony A6400 still worth purchasing today? And how does the Sony A6700 change the way you upgrade? We'll talk about these things and more. So stay to the end and I'll share how you can upgrade your camera and save $2,000. The Sony A6400 was released in 2019 alongside the Sony A6600 later that year. The main differences were really that the Sony A6600 had in-body stabilization and the bigger Z battery. For nearly $600 more, it wasn't worth the upgrade when you could spend that money for a stabilizer and a battery bank. 4 years later, we now have the Sony A6700, and I'm telling you, this is a camera worth paying attention to because it largely influences how you plan to upgrade your gear, especially for beginners. After shooting photos and videos with the Sony A6400 for almost 2 years and the Sony A6700 for almost 2 months, here's what I found. When it comes to image quality, the Sony A6700 looks better in 4K and 1080 than the A6400, as it does look sharper. More often than not, I am shooting 4K out of both of these cameras and it's no problem. But when I need to shoot in higher frame rates for speed ramping or slow motion, I need to shoot in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. It's just that I can only shoot 4K 24 and 4K 30 out of the Sony A6400. Whereas with the Sony A6700, I can shoot all of these. But these days, 1080 at 60 or 120 frames per second is still able to do the job, unless you or your clients really need 4K at these frame rates. If you need more options for 4K, the Sony A6700 offers different codecs that are from the most compressed with XAVC-HS 4K to least compressed at XAVC-SI 4K. So shooting 4K doesn't have to be as bad on your memory storage. The Sony A6700 is also better in low light with its backside illuminated CMOS sensor compared to the regular CMOS sensor in the Sony A6400. The A6700's dual base ISO is at 800 and 2500, while the Sony A6400 only has a base ISO of 100. Others have mentioned that they feel more comfortable raising the ISOs for both photo and video, and I can agree. When it comes to running and gutting, it's getting that shot and being able to clear it up in post if you don't have that lighting. Otherwise, I try to maintain those ISOs of 800 and 2500 for the Sony A6700 and under 1600 to 3200 on the Sony A6400. When it comes to photos, you'll have more flexibility when you shoot RAW and have more playroom when editing your image. However, when it comes to video, you have less flexibility and need to be in the practice of getting it as best you can in camera and spending less time fixing it in post. So far, the Sony A6700 image quality is a win, but this doesn't make the Sony A6400 irrelevant. Now, in a similar way that both these cameras provide you a RAW format to edit your photos with, both these cameras have picture profiles available to enable you to color correct and color grade your footage in post. This way, you can push your colors in the way that you want and give your videos a different feel. Picture profiles don't give you flexibility like RAW, but they do provide log, which is close as we can get. Now, when you mention picture profiles and color grading, we can't ignore color bit depth, which is how many colors someone can bring out when color grading videos and color correcting. The Sony A6700 has 10-bit, while the Sony A6400 only has 8-bit. This matters a lot when pushing colors, keying out colors for green screen, and more. I did make a video about this, but to save you time, just to know that everyone does not need 10-bit, so you can still get much done with 8-bit. The Sony A6400 keeps up in today's world of shooting video, but if you need a little bit more features and flexibility, the Sony A6700 is already on par with other features in Sony's full-frame camera lineup. When looking at the exterior of these cameras, you'll notice a few things other than the Sony A6700 being a little bigger than the Sony A6400. The record button on the A6400 has moved to the top of the Sony A6700. Then where the record button used to be is now a custom button. And the menu, AF/MF button, and the AEL button have moved. Other than that, the other buttons have been the same. From the Sony A6400 to the Sony A6700, we're still using micro HDMI, but then we've also replaced the micro USB to a USB-C port and have gained a headphone jack. Now this next part is still a bummer because both of these only have a single card slot. These single card slots are different though. The A6700 can use up to UHS-2 V90 SD cards, so you can at least record 4K 60 and 4K 120 in S&Q mode. Even if you're not recording 4K 60 on the Sony A6400, you'll have a hard time using these same cards, as it gives you annoying pop-ups that say, the camera doesn't recognize the memory card. So if you plan on using your higher end SD card on your Sony A6400, hold off on it and buy it when you actually get a Sony A6700. I would just so love to see an APS-C camera other than the FX30 with a dual SD card slot from Sony. Moving back to the top of the camera, we noticed something else, the dials. Unfortunately, the Sony A6400 does not have a setting to separate the photo and video settings. So most of it is separated through the custom settings on the mode dial, using manual, custom 1, custom 2, and custom 3. So you actually have a total of up to 16 custom settings. I'm making a video about this, so do subscribe to see that. But for the most part, this is great for on the fly, running and gunning. As you're running and gunning, how often do you shoot handheld? Because when it comes to in-body image stabilization, the Sony A6400 doesn't have it. You'll have to use a stabilizer like a tripod, monopod, or gimbal. Otherwise, use a lens with optical steady shot, like the Sony 18-105mm f4. The Sony A6700 is a win in this category, as it doesn't just have standard stabilization, but also has active stabilization, which you can find in the higher end full frame cameras like the Sony A7S III and Sony A7 IV. Plus, when you add stabilization in post, you're set. Leave your gimbal at home for your cinematic vlogs. Since both of these cameras have unlimited recording and can shoot 4K, they are prone to overheating if you push either or both of these features. If you're shooting short clips here and there, no big deal. I can almost get 2 hours recording 4K with the Sony A6700, whereas the Sony A6400, I could get about an hour and a half before overheating. But even if you could almost double your record time by recording in 1080 instead of 4K, remember, the Sony A6400 has half the battery size than the A6700. So even if your camera doesn't overheat, your battery will die. So just in case, use a battery bank to keep your camera charged, especially for the Sony A6700, which does support quick charging at 9 volts or 3 amps, or 9 volts and 2 amps. I don't recommend either of these cameras for recording podcasts or wedding ceremonies in camera, but you could get away with using these cameras to record podcasts or other long form videos on your computer by using a software like OBS or other streaming based softwares. But if you're just shooting photos, overheating isn't a concern. For a day trip though, you may need 2 to 3 batteries for your Sony A6400 and only 1, maybe 2 for your Sony A6700. Both of these cameras are excellent for photos. With the Sony A6700, you're getting 26 megapixels and the Sony A6400 is giving you 24.2 megapixels. Plus, unlike the Sony's vlogging cameras, we have 2.36 million dot viewfinders that we can shoot with. I often shoot with the articulating screens, so the viewfinder isn't major for me. Just know that the Sony A6400 has its tilting screen, whereas the A6700 articulates out to the side and can tilt. While shooting, you may notice the continuous shooting up to 11 frames per second with both cameras, but that much hasn't changed. Both of these cameras have face and eye autofocus, but the Sony A6700 has even more improved autofocus because of the AI. It's able to not only track eyes and faces, but also other animals and other subjects. But when it does track eyes and faces, it could even track them when your model is turned around. That's crazy. And I have confirmed that Sony's AI autofocus also works when you're using the Sigma MC11 adapter. I didn't get to use it for long, but I have seen it track. On a side note, if you're into it, the onboard flash that is on the Sony A6400 is no longer on the Sony A6700. I never recommend that anybody use the on-camera flash, but don't be surprised when it's gone. Have you noticed the $600 difference between these two cameras thus far? It seems easy to say that if you can afford it, the Sony A6700 is an easy choice if you're after better video features. But what if you're actually trying to upgrade to full frame one day? Are you upgrading because of just the sensor? Or is it also because of the pro features too? Dual SD cards, higher resolutions, bigger body, built-in fan, no crop in 4K 120 or 4K 60, higher dual base ISO. Because if we take a step back to look at the bigger picture of the Sony camera lineup, although the Sony A6700 is not full frame, it shares similar features to its more expensive full frame counterparts. You see, similar to the coveted Sony A7S III, it provides different codecs in 4K 60 and 4K 120. Unlike the Sony A7S III, it does crop at 4K 120, but the A7 IV does not give 4K 120 at all. But like the Sony A7 IV, it also has a mode dial for photo, video, and S&Q, which allows you to program a total of 16 different custom settings. Without buying the Sony A7R5, you're getting the AI technology to track the eyes of different subjects, or even different subjects entirely, like planes and trains. And just like the top-notch vlog camera, the Sony ZV-E1, you're getting the auto framing where the camera tracks you and keeps you centered in frame wherever you walk. In addition, you can also have the option to burn in your own LUTs and even use them as previews. These are features that will keep you using your camera for a long time. But let's bring back the Sony A6400 and summarize all of this. All in all, the Sony A6400 is indeed older, but not outdated, as it's still great for beginners and prosumers. All the upgrades in the Sony A6700 are excellent, but beginners will benefit more from spending the difference of $600 on lenses and even lighting, especially if you're more of a photo shooter than video. Even if you do shoot lots of video, you already have a great video capable camera with unlimited recording and picture profiles for your images, with the Sony A6400, of course. If you're more serious about video, the Sony A6700 is worth the upgrade if you've already got your lenses and don't plan on going full frame, because this is how you really save $2,000. To go from the Sony A6400 to the latest A7 IV, you're almost spending $750 to $2,500, a $1,750 difference. But then you still have to spend at least $500 to $1,000 to get decent lenses for it. Yes, full frame has its own advantages of low light and more shallow depth of field, but if you want some of the more latest video features, you don't have to go full frame to get 4K 60, 4K 120, and even want to burn in your own LUTs. If you desire to have that full frame look, that's fine. You know you want it, you will buy it someday. But if you're looking for more pro features and functionality out of your camera, like dual card slots, built-in fan, and not having to switch to full frame, you may want to consider the Sony FX30. I sold my Sony A7S III for two of them. Here's a comparison between the Sony A6400 and the FX30, and the Sony A6700 versus the FX30 coming up here, so subscribe to see that.